The Grand Concert Hall in New York City shimmered under crystal chandeliers, its velvet seats packed with an eager audience who had come to witness the genius of Alexander Beaumont, the world-famous pianist known as much for his brilliance as for his arrogance. As the final notes of his encore faded, the crowd roared with thunderous applause, rising to their feet. Alexander stood, soaking it in, and offered an elegant bow that seemed more self-congratulatory than gracious. Backstage for a moment, he sipped water and exchanged a smirk with his manager. "Watch me have a little fun with them," he said, a hint of mischief and cruelty lighting his eyes. He strode back onto the stage with theatrical flair, commanding silence with a simple gesture. Then he let his gaze wander slowly over the sea of faces until he spotted her. In the front row sat a woman who looked wildly out of place among the city's elite. Her dress was plain, her hair simply tied back, and her hands nervously clutched a worn handbag. Alexander's lip curled ever so slightly as he leaned toward the microphone. "Madam," he drawled with mock-polished charm, "why don't you come up and show us how it's done?" The words, delivered like a joke, drew a ripple of uncomfortable laughter from the audience. Some were amused, delighted by the promise of watching this unassuming woman stumble and fail. Others shifted in their seats, uneasy at the cruelty thinly veiled as humor. The woman froze, eyes wide. Color drained from her face as hundreds of eyes turned to her. She glanced around, as if hoping someone would intervene, but Alexander merely gestured toward the stage with exaggerated courtesy. The spotlight followed her, forcing her to stand. Slowly, almost painfully, she rose to her feet, every movement betraying her reluctance and fear. As she climbed the short steps to the stage, Alexander offered his hand like a master of ceremonies. But the glint in his eyes was unkind. He bowed theatrically, stepping aside to give her the bench, turning to the audience with a smug, knowing look. The hush in the hall was sharp and expectant. Everyone waited, convinced they were about to witness an embarrassing spectacle, a lesson in why true talent, they believed, was reserved for the chosen few. Alexander leaned back against the piano, arms folded, ready to savor the humiliation he had so carefully orchestrated. The spotlight swung to the woman, trapping her in its harsh glare as the entire hall turned to stare. She froze, her eyes wide with shock, looking like she wished the floor would swallow her whole. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her worn handbag, and her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself smaller. A few people in the audience exchanged uneasy glances, but others nudged each other, grinning at the spectacle they were sure was about to unfold. A smattering of applause, half encouraging and half mocking, rippled through the seats. Someone called out, "Go on," in a teasing voice, prompting nervous laughter. Her cheeks flushed a deep crimson. She shook her head at first, glancing pleadingly at the usher, but there was no way out. The crowd had taken on a life of its own, egging her on as if it were all part of the entertainment. Slowly, reluctantly, she rose from her seat. Every step toward the stage felt heavy, her eyes cast down to avoid meeting the sea of amused, expectant faces. Her breathing was shallow and quick. She clutched her handbag like a shield as she climbed the steps, pausing once to steady herself. Alexander watched it all unfold with smug satisfaction. When she finally stood before him on stage, he gave the audience a conspiratorial wink, drawing another round of knowing laughter. The message was clear, they were all in on the joke. This was their shared moment of fun at someone else's expense. He turned to her with exaggerated courtesy, sweeping his arm toward the polished black piano. "Please," he said, his voice dripping with theatrical politeness, "impress us." The words landed like a slap, and she blinked rapidly, swallowing hard. Her fingers trembled as she stepped closer to the bench. The hall fell quiet, but it wasn't a respectful silence. It was the hush of anticipation before a stumble, before the collective exhale of cruel amusement. Yet amid the laughter and expectant smirks, a few in the audience looked genuinely uncomfortable. They shifted in their seats, uneasy with how far it had gone, but no one spoke up. The atmosphere crackled with tension, the weight of unspoken complicity pressing down on everyone as she finally sat at the piano, hands shaking, the lights glaring down. The hall fell into a tense, watchful silence as she lowered herself onto the piano bench. The spotlight shone harshly on her face, revealing the fear in her eyes and the quick rise and fall of her chest. She sat frozen for a moment, hands hovering uncertainly above the keys, trembling so visibly that even those who had been snickering grew quiet. The only sound was her shallow breathing, loud in the hush. Then she closed her eyes. Slowly, she exhaled, shoulders lowering as though shedding the weight of every mocking gaze. Her fingers came to rest on the keys, hesitant at first, then pressed down. A single, clear note rang out. Another followed, softer this time, weaving a fragile melody that felt like it might break apart at any second. But it didn't. Instead, the notes began to flow in a simple but hauntingly beautiful progression, each one layered with raw, unfiltered emotion. The melody was untrained, imperfect, but it was real. The restless shifting in the audience stopped. Heads tilted forward. Breath caught in throats. It was as if the entire room had been yanked from cynical amusement into something they didn't understand but couldn't look away from. The music swelled gently, telling a story of loss, of hope, of love that had no words. Eyes that had gleamed with laughter now brimmed with tears. A woman in the second row dabbed at her cheeks with a tissue. A man lowered his head, blinking rapidly. The hush was no longer uncomfortable, it was reverent. Alexander Beaumont, who had been leaning against the piano with folded arms, straightened slowly. His smirk slipped away. He stared at her hands as they moved with surprising confidence, the music building in waves of emotion that seemed to shake the very walls of the hall. He leaned forward, eyes fixed, unable to hide the wonder overtaking his face. And then, silence. The final note faded into the vast space, hanging in the air like a ghost. She let her hands fall into her lap, breathing hard, eyes still closed. For a heartbeat, no one dared move. The entire hall sat frozen in the aftermath of something profoundly human and deeply moving. For a moment after the final note died away, the hall remained frozen in hushed reverence, as though no one dared disturb the sacred silence she had created. Then, all at once, the spell broke. Applause thundered through the room, shattering the quiet with raw, unrestrained emotion. People leapt to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to shake the floor itself. She sat there stunned, blinking at the flood of light and noise, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, as if waking from a dream, she rose from the bench. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she wiped at them with shaking fingers, trying to compose herself enough to manage a small, trembling smile. Her eyes scanned the sea of people clapping and cheering for her, not mocking her, not laughing at her, but truly seeing her. Alexander moved before he even realized he was doing it. The arrogance that had lit his face earlier was gone, replaced with something raw and vulnerable. He stepped toward her slowly, almost hesitantly, as if afraid to break the fragile moment. When he finally reached her side, he swallowed hard, his voice low and thick with emotion. "That was extraordinary," he managed, his eyes glistening as he searched her face for understanding. "Who taught you?" She looked at him through her tears, her lips quivering with the weight of what she was about to say. Her voice cracked softly, but the words were clear enough to carry across the stage. "No one," she whispered. "I just play what I feel. It's for my late son. He loved piano." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. His carefully constructed facade crumbled completely, and he closed his eyes for a moment, breathing shakily. Then, with no regard for the watching crowd, he opened his arms and pulled her into a gentle embrace. She stiffened at first, surprised, but then sank against him, sobbing quietly into his shoulder as the audience roared its approval. It wasn't the show anyone had expected. It wasn't polished, planned, or perfect. But it was real. And in that embrace, under the glaring stage lights, two very different people found common ground in shared grief, shared beauty, and a single act of unfiltered humanity. The stage glowed with warm, golden light as the applause raged on, refusing to fade. The woman stood there, breathless, cheeks damp with tears, overwhelmed by the sea of people on their feet cheering for her. Alexander turned to her, his face transformed from arrogance to something gentle and proud. He took her trembling hand in his and slowly lifted it high, as if declaring her the true champion of the night. The crowd roared even louder. Some wiped at their eyes openly, moved beyond words. Cameras flashed, but for once they weren't capturing a celebrity's smug triumph, they were recording a moment of pure, shared humanity. Alexander turned back to the audience, his voice ringing clear and sincere through the grand hall. "Tonight's real artist is here," he said, his eyes shining. "Let's remember something important. Music isn't about perfection, it's about the heart." His words washed over the audience like balm, drawing nods and applause that felt deeper than any polite ovation. He turned back to her, squeezing her hand gently. "Join me for my next charity concert," he said earnestly. "Play with me. Let them hear what music really is." She shook her head quickly at first, her eyes wide, her smile humble and uncertain. "Oh no, I couldn't. I'm no one, really," she stammered. But he wouldn't accept it. He leaned closer, voice low but insistent. "Please. Don't hide what you have. Share it. The world needs this." Moved by his sincerity, she finally nodded through fresh tears. The audience erupted into cheers so wild they seemed to shake the chandeliers above. People hugged each other, clapped until their hands hurt, some crying freely at the simple beauty of what they'd witnessed. As the stage lights glowed brighter, a hush fell one last time, and the narrator's voice closed the night. "Sometimes, the simplest hearts carry the deepest music. And a single act of kindness can change everything." And in that moment, surrounded by warmth, applause, and the glow of human connection, the concert hall didn't just witness a performance, it witnessed the power of compassion, humility, and the music that lives in every heart willing to share it.